Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 344, August the 11th, 1978, side 1. Well, before I get too far into this, I want to apologize for this tape if the tape cassette is not the same quality as KLRB or the machinery. The last 2 weeks the tapes were slow, and my tape cassette machine timing was off. I'd had it in the shop to be repaired several times, and it broke consistently, and I borrowed a loan machine for making these tapes from the man who fixes my machines. It's a little bit scratchy. It's a Sanyo. It's supposed to do the job, but it'll be little bit scratchy, and the speed for the last 2 weeks was too slow, and we tried to compensate it in getting it out to you. But what was normal and what I taped at the house was normal was off when it went to the tape center to be duplicated, and their machines are right, and mine was wrong, and I had to have it fixed. And that was quite disconcerting. I've gone through a series of things here at the house that have broken, machinery broken, and it goes in spells. I guess many of you know appliances and things do fall apart in spells. But everything at the house will break at one time, and it's a little disconcerting, particularly at first I was only going to send one tape this week and not for the next 2 weeks while I was on vacation. I decided to change my vacation plans because I was feeling insecure about having said too much about where I was going in advance, and got a couple of messages that made me feel that I should be a little more cautious about what I was doing. And also there's a lot of material I wanted to get out, and I didn't want to lose those 2 weeks of time because I do want to do a tape next week on Patty Hearst and one the week after on Evel Younger, and I don't want to wait so close to the fall to get into those, so I'll be sending those out. But as soon as I escalated my projects and decided what I wanted to do, my tape cassette didn't work, and I decided I had to leave that off, and I used my daughter's tape cassette, which has always worked. We recorded stuff recently, and the speed went around and no sound comes out of it, and I left that off. And the copying machine this last week, the copies that I duplicate went fuzzy, and there's no exposure that fixes that, and my typewriter blocked, and we left it off where I always have the typewriter fixed, and in the shop it works fine, and when it comes back to the house, when I touch the tab to go back to the left column, the typewriter locks and doesn't work. It went in the machine shop a second time, and it works there, and nothing is wrong, and it comes back, and it doesn't work again, and then a third time. So I had the two tape cassettes broken, the typewriter broken, and decided in the copying machine. And then I'd ordered stationery with that World Watchers logo, the world on it, and I waited 6 weeks. I ordered it in May and waited 6 weeks. It actually took 7 weeks to come, and when it came, the little cards had that world on them. Some of you received those already, the little World Watcher International card, and the stationery had the logo of a ship, the nautical sign around, as if it was a yacht or something around the circle, the nautical circle. And I looked at it, and I don't have a yacht, and it isn't what I ordered, and so they had to take back the 1,000 envelopes and paper and order a new World Watcher. And they looked in the book to see where they made a mistake, because the logo was the same for the cards and the printer was the same as the stationery, and they couldn't find anywhere in the books the logo for the nautical sign. And they don't know where it came from, but the nautical logo was on the stationery, and there was no explanation. Well, when all these things come down, it's time for May, to relax, because in some way I'm getting a message, and I decided to take the weekend off and go to the psychic fair out at Asilomar, which coincidentally was happening just this weekend, and goodness knows it was time. Nothing around here was working, and I had all these tapes to get out. And there's a group called the Luxus Circle that had annual conventions, and they're going to be in London next year, and they were at Asilomar Conference Grounds. So I went out there and heard some fabulous lectures, and Friday night was Thelma Moss talking about holistic healing, which I'll give you a little bit of opinion on. I'm very much into holistic healing, and she works at UCLA. She's a PhD who's done the wonderful photographs of energy and the trillion photographs. She's been in the Soviet Union, and she works with the Russians, and she works in photographing energy and writing books on holistic healing. And along with her was Stephen Schwartz from Los Angeles, who has written a book on investigations of archaeological diggings used by psychics to find those particular diggings, and how psychics in Mexico and in Scotland and Ireland and Africa have led the archaeologists to buildings and architecturally rebuilt them and drew pictures of people that were buried in there literally 1,000 years ago, long time ago, and diggings a few hundred years back. They've been pretty specific, and he started out, Stephen Schwartz, working for the National Geographic, and was into these archaeological digs, and then met psychics in these various countries that led them, and got more into studying the psychic part of archaeology, and gave a fantastic slideshow on that subject. And then there's Marjorie Chomiak talking about dowsing. She's going to bring an instrument to the house, a dowsing instrument that she uses for energy fields. I am supposed to keep certain minerals in the house as counteracting what does supposedly to your body by using typewriters and copying machines and equipment around you all the time. I used to have some of those things that Wayne Cook had given me, and I haven't had them around lately. But she's coming to the house with a dowser, and then there was a gentleman, Hal Broda, who used to work for Dow Chemical, and he gave a lecture on, no, it wasn't Hal Broda. Hal Broda was on the haunted houses. It was Stephen Langer, who's into holistic medicine, who gave a lecture on Sunday morning, and it was he who worked for Dow Chemical, and said that in the Soviet Union and the United States, they are pretty advanced at making objects and clothing disappear. They asked me if I had things disappearing from the house, and I told them yes, and that I would always blame them on my daughter, Bonnie, who passed away when she was 14. It's sort of a family joke that Bonnie takes these sweaters or takes these pens and objects that once they go, they never return again. And they said that they experiment in the Soviet Union and in the United States in taking things, clothing and items away from people to disconcert them and to test their sensitivity and keep them off guard. And I remember when I was up in Canada on our property 7 years ago, it was this summer, and we'd been out digging clams and so forth, and we returned back to the tent trailer, and the middle of the floor was a nightgown that belonged to my daughter, who had died just 7 or 8 months earlier. Well, you can believe that's a little disconcerting to be up at Vancouver Island and be out all day and living in a tent area where you've unpacked and packed everything and find Bonnie's nightgown on the floor of the trailer. We have things that are left here and things that are taken, and this has happened to me continuously since she passed away, so you can see my interest in studying haunted houses. And I was talking to them early in the evening about the equipment here that isn't working, that's all breaks down at one time and jams. And the lecture that evening by Hal Broda Saturday night was investigating haunted houses, and he takes letters from different people and checks out particular houses and what they believe are ghosts in those houses. And he told about a woman that worked in an office, and no telephone system, Bell telephone or other telephone systems, could work. And wherever she worked with the telephones, they continuously jammed for no scientific reason, and they would change the whole phone system. And there was no way that when this particular person worked on these telephones that the phone systems worked. They worked for everybody else but couldn't work for her. And when he talked about that, these various people that had talked to me earlier looked at me because we were talking about the fact that my typewriter works in the shop and doesn't work at the house, and the recorder works out of the house and doesn't work in the house. And I'm too stubborn to move all of this stuff into different rooms of the house. I'm going to try and stay in the study where I am and find the answers, but it is something around me, and for me not to share it with you would be ridiculous. Thelma Moss talked about healing, which is very important. She's worked with Norman Cousins, who's had a treacherous disease where he was completely paralyzed and ready to die, a painful spinal disease, and he went about curing himself. And I have done a process of curing various diseases, from a multiple sclerosis in my sister-in-law to my own hay fever and various. I haven't done a lot of it for other people, mostly my own particular family around me. I wouldn't stand the risk of nosing into other people. I've had no training, but I've been very successful in handling diseases, and I was telling them that I would someday give a lecture at the group or talk or have a workshop on the specific things that I've done and how I've cured them, and to help other people with those matters. We talked about angels, guardian angels. Dory D'Angelo talked about that, and she confirmed what I know, that I get a certain vision of people. It's like an arrow and a dart, like the angel Valentine concept, that I have to protect. And one was always Hugo Pinel, who is in prison and currently serving a long sentence, and the other was Robert Hyde, and the other was Patty Hearst. And I always felt I could help those people stay alive. And Robert Hyde is out of the prison and very much alive and doing well. And Hugo stayed alive through the main era where he certainly was marked for death in the prison system. His buddy, Jeffrey Colden, a friend that I used to correspond with and tried to help, died last week at San Quentin Prison. He's very political. His wife was down in Cuba with the meeting that Fidel Castro had. And Jeffrey Colden is the father of 4 children and doesn't belong in the prison system. He's politically aware, supposedly died by running into a wall when he was playing football. Then they said his head hit a pipe, but there was no blood on the pipe. The outrage in this country should be identical to the death of Stephen Biko in South Africa, but it's always easier to see things far away, and not much is written. He gives the name Qatari. That was an African name he took, and I corresponded with him for quite a few years. He was very bitter about the way I was approaching my work and tangled and fought with me quite a bit, and I just didn't have the same determination that I had to guard over Hugo Pinel. I didn't wish him harm, but I wished him well, as a matter of fact. But I always had a complex about being here to help Hugo and Robert Hyde and Patty. Of course, 4 years ago, I wrote the article, "The SLA is the CIA." A year ago, I had called her priest, Reverend Dumke, and pleaded to help them. And he said he lost the article. And just last week, somebody came to Patty Hearst and said, "Mae Brussell can help you. You should get in touch with Mae." And she told her priest, and he said, "I'm in touch with Mae." And the tape next week will be on Patty Hearst and the protective shield of how to protect Patty Hearst at this time, and an update of my SLA article. I think I can save her life if they will do the things that I'm telling them to do, and I've made out a program. So we talked about angels at the meeting, and one of the interesting parts of this psychic fair or meeting that the Luxus Circle had, again, was the description of Stephen Schwartz using psychics to help locate a ship in Catalina Island off Los Angeles. And they used 3 psychics to ask, what would you find if we went down here? And each one didn't know each other and was not familiar with the area. And they locked their findings, I think, into either Berkeley or Harvard Library and kept them with somebody. And each one was separate, not working, as I said, with each other. And one described a Y-shaped object and the other a square block object, and they described where a ship was located. So they took a ship leaving off near San Diego at opposite Catalina and took a small submarine with a large crane that digs up objects and a glass wall, and it shows these various people and Mr. Schwartz down in the ship, and they brought up this large Y-shaped object that was filled with barnacles about 90 years old and a huge square block of concrete about 6 feet square that I don't think they could get out with the instruments they had. And they did find a ship that was about 90 years old that had never been recorded in any history book, or they had no knowledge of it in the area. And he believes strongly in the use of psychics to do research into archaeological diggings. Now, you may wonder, with this long introduction, why psychics have anything to do with, say, political assassinations. But there's one thing that I have to make clear for those of you who don't know me or be a little shocked by my saying it, sometimes people are, is that I believe in these psychic phenomena, and that I had never read a mystery story or owned a book, a mystery story, until John Kennedy was killed. And the only psychic phenomena that happened to me was some kind of a voice that when we were in India, and I was just about to turn 15 years old, I was 14 plus, about 2 weeks before my birthday, and we took a trip around the world, and we were in India. And I saw all these people on the streets lying down at night with no home, and just Bombay and Calcutta, and it really affected me deeply. And I don't remember then whether it was a voice or whether I was just talking to myself. And I said, "You're going to do something to help people someday." And I didn't know what it meant. It was very ingrained into my head. And I was going to Beverly Hills High School at the time, and I already knew that in a couple of years I really wanted to go to Stanford. And I really didn't have any goals. I wasn't politically into the Cold War period. I wasn't interested so much, even when I was married and had children, into the Rosenberg case, the Alger hiss. And I was mostly just concerned with my own family, my own immediate children, and husbands. Had two by 1952, 53. Been married twice, and I just went through school and didn't know what the calling was. But in the back of my mind, there was some kind of a message, and I can't really translate it, except I thought it was terrible. But I had no direction and no guide. And then, with the day that John Kennedy was killed, I watched the television and followed the news and felt pretty badly. We'd taken the boys to see the nomination speech of John Kennedy down in Los Angeles at the Coliseum. And the day, 2 days after John Kennedy was killed, November the 24th, 1963, Jack Ruby plunged forward and killed Lee Harvey Oswald. And it was then that I got a flash, I guess what you would call a psychic flash, and it really scared me. And I remember what I did. I left the family room where we were watching this phenomena, and I went to the telephone and I called my father, and I don't know why, but I just did. And I said, I broke down the conspiracy and what I thought had happened, and that Jack Ruby was involved, and that he worked with these racists, and the racists would link to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi connections, and that the world would be in turmoil because of what Jack Ruby did, and that I was really terrified. And all of a sudden, I had these 5 children and a family, and it frightened me terrifically. And Jack Ruby had been arrested. They picked him up right away, and there was a lot of commotion, and many of you have reconstructed the tapes or the books of those moments, and they said, "Who is he? Who is he?" And there was a scrambling in the Dallas jail. And there was a comment, "Oh, you know Jack Ruby, he's a police buff, and he's been around the police department." And somebody even said he had been arrested once for illegally having weapons. It's funny that they recognized him for that, and he'd still been in the jail, but he went down the ramp so fast that even that person might not have even seen Jack Ruby in the crowd. But what I heard when I watched this altercation of Jack Ruby, Lee Harvey Oswald, I heard the sentence on the TV, or in my head, say, Jack Ruby was at the home of H.L. Hunt the afternoon of November 23rd, 1963, from 2 to 5 o'clock, either 3 to 5 or 2 to 5. And I checked the ABC News and the CBS and the NBC, and all those people that have taped the assassination news since the day John Kennedy was killed, and nobody else ever heard that. And that had to be a psychic calling to me, go after that lead, because no one else, as I say, I don't know of any other person, and I'm putting this out for you to research or investigate, ever heard that before. And it stayed in my head, and I began to collect newspapers on the assassination, and the Warren Report came out in September of '64. I increased my subscriptions to newspapers, and then I bought the Warren Commission hearings, and my husband gave them to me for a Christmas present, and in December they came out in '64, and the 26 volumes came out. Oh, I mean, they were goodies. They were brand new and bound and tight. Now mine are all threadbare and underlined and marked all over. And I opened up volume 9. I didn't know where to turn first, and that was a testimony of George DeMohrenschildt, who had praised Himmler at the Petroleum Club in Texas, and later Jean DeMohrenschildt this year said that her husband was a close friend of H.L. Hunt, the oilman. She testified, I understand, in Washington, D.C., that he was close to H.L. Hunt, the oilman, and he also was the man who visited Lee Harvey Oswald Marina first when Oswald was away and made her acquaintance with Colonel Lawrence Orloff, and then became the CIA babysitter of Lee Harvey Oswald in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And his wife, Jean DeMohrenschildt, was brought over here by the Howard Hughes organization, and her husband worked for the CIA. Her daughter was married to the son of Vice President of Lockheed, and the rest is history in terms of the way I began to pursue my work. But as I went through the testimony of the 26 volumes all those years, I think it's sort of interesting to dwell on the psychic lead I got and how it's been handled in the past 15 years in terms of evidence, because I think that psychic work can be done in terms of the assassinations, and I'll write it up someday, just as Mr. Schwartz is doing with psychic archaeological diggings. The same way after the accident at Chappaquiddick, we were camping down at Big Sur campgrounds, and I called Mrs. Kopechny and told her before the fingerprints get too dry, fingerprint the steering wheel, that Ted Kennedy wasn't driving the car was overturned, that he was given a substance and made drowsy and was asleep and removed from the car and didn't drive it, and Mary Jo was asleep in back of the car. I didn't know who turned over the car, who drove it over the edge, and I said, have an autopsy, there'll be chemicals in her stomach. And Mrs. Kopechny said to me, well, why are you telling me this? And I said, well, they're using this excuse to keep Ted Kennedy from running for president in 1972, and your daughter is a selected patsy, and that she's identical to Officer Tippett in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, who had to be murdered in excuse for arresting Lee Harvey Oswald immediately after the assassination and bring him in on something so that they could then shoot him in the custody of the police department. And everyone seeing the shooting right there would say, well, how could it be a conspiracy? We all saw it in front of our eyes. Mrs. Kopechny didn't have an autopsy. She didn't ask for one. A few years later, just a year or two ago, she said the one thing she regretted was that she never had an autopsy of Mary Jo Kopechny. And I believe that some substances are not traceable in the body, but then again they might be, and because she had blood on her blouse and shirt that couldn't have been received from the drowning, they should have demanded an investigation along the lines that I suggested, but of course they didn't, and that is history. Well, what about Jack Ruby? I wanted to talk about Jack Ruby and the testimony from the Warren Commission hearings, and if any of you have anything to add on this in your research, by all means send it to me. There was the testimony of Mr. Rossi in the 26 volumes that Jack Ruby was in the building in the office of H.L. Hunt on Wednesday before the assassination. He had, in fact, been at the office of Hunt on Wednesday before. There was evidence that he was accompanied. He took Connie Trammell to H.L. Hunt's office. That was the excuse of being there. Connie Trammell was a college graduate who came to Ruby's club for just a very, very short time and went on to work at the Republic National Bank, I believe located in Houston, Texas. And Jack Ruby drove her to H.L. Hunt's office on Wednesday. And Connie Trammell's bank was identified in 1967 at the time of the exposures of the foundations and the CIA as being a source of, in quotes, black money, which is killing money. It was an outlet for paying intelligence jobs, and she worked there. And Connie Trammell had contact to Volkmar Schmidt and Larry Schmidt, the men from Munich, Germany, the 17, 18 men that came to the Dallas-Fort Worth area under the auspices of Attorney Robert Morris, who used to work with Richard Nixon's House Internal Security Committee. And they also infiltrated what was set up as the Young Americans for Freedom, which was started by Douglas Caddy, who worked in the Watergate offices of Mullen. They were exposed at the time of Watergate and formed it with William Buckley, and of course, you know the long association of E. Howard Hunt, his links to the assassination teams, and personal close work in the CIA with William Buckley. Connie Trammell worked with these people, and she worked with Jack Ruby and was at the office of H.L. Hunt. When Ruby was arrested, on the seat of his car was literature written for a program, Lifeline, that H.L. Hunt put on the air in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and all over the Southwest, and Warren Caroll wrote this material for Lifeline for Hunt, and he also was identified as working in the Central Intelligence Agency. And on the seat of the car were commercials written into the program. It wasn't a program that Jack Ruby could pick up just anywhere. They wanted to know if he got it at the fairgrounds, at the county fair, just prior to the assassination, and there was no way. And this literature was, the whole pitch was, be a hero, come on, be a hero. And someday I'm going to write about the mind control of Bernhard Weissman and Jack Ruby, the two Jews used as a front for the far right-wing assassination conspiracy team. The anti-Semites selected Rubenstein and Weissman as the front men to hide their anti-Semitism. There was a man testifying before Congress this week, a hitman for organized crime and who did various work for members of organized crime and Traffic Canada, and he mentioned that when they did arsons or did hits, they left names of other blacks, as if blacks did it, or radical left, to hide where the source of the crimes were coming from. And it was this way the Kennedy assassination employed these two Jews. So Jack Ruby was at the office of H.L. Hunt, and he was accompanying Connie Trammell with her links to the CIA. He had literature on the seat of his car from a man linked to the CIA and to H.L. Hunt, and George DeMohrenschildt had contact with Hunt and Lee and Marina Oswald. So the psychic view that I had that Jack Ruby was with Hunt needed further examination. And in the testimony of Jack Ruby in Volume 5 of the Warren Commission hearings and in Volume 14, they account in questioning for Jack Ruby for every hour that from about Friday afternoon until Sunday when he was arrested, except for those very hours that I heard. It had to be psychically because right then I had those dates and that name to go for my research, and the Warren Commission skirted around everything except that area. Now, one way they handled this, I want to read to you. Some of you have the 26 volumes, but most of you can't get it, and I think it's good to read it with you. It's from Volume 14, and the testimony was July 18, 1964. The way the wording went with Jack Ruby about the plans to kill Lee Harvey Oswald, to show you how they circumvent the area which I was told to follow through whatever source it came. I'm only the medium by which it came. I pass it on to you for whatever it's worth. But I want to read this to you. I wrote a play called Tiger by the Tail, and it's never been put out yet, and I think it's really good. The first act is Jack Ruby with Earl Warren, Leon Jaworski, and Gerald Ford. And the second act is the polygraph test of Jack Ruby, sparring with the Dallas officials, the federal officials, writing his own questions, and working with the Warren Commission in a way that he probably felt that he would finally be released later and get a fair trial. And present at this polygraph test was Arlene Specter, the same Arlene Specter that's running for governor of Pennsylvania now. And the whole text of what I'm going to be reading to you, this section from Volume 14, has to do with foreknowledge of the assassination, and is it possible that he was talking to H.L. Hunt about killing Lee Harvey Oswald. Arlene Specter created that famous Bullet 399, that hogwash of ballistic misinformation, and he represents the Warren Commission at this little section I'm going to read to you. And then there's Belle Hurden and W. James Wood, agents of the FBI, who are to give Jack Ruby the polygraph test. Clayton Fowler is the attorney that Jack Ruby took on at this time for the polygraph test, and he's in the room with him. And Joe Tannehill is a wealthy oil man who always was in the cell with Jack Ruby wearing a gun, and Ruby tried to get him out, always kicked him out. They said, you don't have the mental judgment to get Tannehill out of the room. Tannehill represented the oil people and the oil interest and was always present. And Ruby said he distorted things and lied about him, and he said, you're not my lawyer. And the Warren Commission and the federal agency said, well, being as you're crazy, you can't decide to fire him. And the basis upon which he was crazy was that he shot a man on national television where everyone saw him, and therefore he was crazy. And William Alexander's in the room. He's the assistant district attorney for Dallas County, and Alan Sweet, criminal deputy for the Dallas County in Texas, and Holman was the chief jailer, and Dr. William Beavers was an observer in the room. And I'm going to just show you how the Warren Commission and Jack Ruby were able to cover up any possible links to when Jack Ruby might have planned to kill Lee Harvey Oswald. This is, as I say, Volume 14. Mr. Hurden, who's giving the polygraph test, said, we'll proceed to what we call Series 3. Here the questions are intermixed. Some are pertinent and others aren't. And this is the question he asked him. Between the assassination and the shooting, did anybody you know tell you they knew Lee Harvey Oswald? Now, up to that point, they said, were you born in Chicago? He said, yes. Did you ever make a false statement on a legal application? He said, no. Were you born in 1911? Yes. So then we'll turn this slide over now. We're just about at the end, and then I'll get into the interview of Jack Ruby and his polygraph test on his foreknowledge of the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald. Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. This is August the 11th, 1978, Side 2, and this is tape number 345. Keep in mind, this is a play I wrote. I had a jester making comments. I'll make them in exchange for the jester's role, but I really love the interrogation of Jack Ruby. Again, the question that he had from the FBI was between the assassination and the shooting. That's from Friday, November 22nd, 1963, at noon, and the shooting of Lee Harvey Oswald on Sunday. Did anybody you know tell you they knew Oswald? Which is a 2-day time. And Jack Ruby said no. He didn't know anyone who knew Oswald in those 2 days. And then the FBI said, did you tell anyone that you were thinking of shooting Oswald before you did it? And Jack Ruby said, no. Yes, I take that back. Sunday morning, I want to elaborate on that. Before I left my apartment, ask me that question again. So the FBI said, let's go over it once more, Mr. Ruby. I want you to be able to be in a position that you can freely, honestly, and truthfully answer it simply, yes or no. Ruby, will you specify the time? The time element is very important. Mr. Herndon's the FBI man. The only time element is before you did it. Now, he said before you did it is a very broad coverage. Of course, to make the question, did you discuss Oswald with anybody before you did it, implies that he was at the office of H.L. Hunt with Connor Tamel. That would be interesting. But he's left himself open, the FBI. Before you did it, did you discuss it? And Ruby said, that's it. That's a difficult question to answer. Herndon says, that's the way the question is worded. Let me ask it again and see if you want to discuss it. Did you tell anyone that you were thinking of shooting Oswald before you did it? And Jack Ruby said, why don't you say this, that Sunday morning specifically? In other words, keep it just to Sunday morning. Forget what happened on Saturday afternoon that I'm talking about, or the Wednesday before. Ruby said that would be easier for me to answer. And Herndon said, in other words, did you tell anyone you were thinking of shooting Oswald on Sunday morning? And Ruby says to Fowler, his attorney, Fowler, it puts me in a tough spot when he asks me that question, and I evade it. And Arlene Specter of the Warren Commission said, if you would like us to break it down, we could do it in 2 questions. Did you tell anybody on Sunday morning you were going to shoot Oswald before you did it? Now that takes it away again from Saturday afternoon or Wednesday. Ruby, that's easier to answer. Specter, then we can ask you this. Before Sunday morning, did you tell anybody you intended to shoot Oswald? And Ruby said, now before Sunday morning means any time element beyond that time I left my apartment, and he stays with that Sunday part. Is that what you're referring to when you say Sunday morning? Inspector said, well, I'll even change that, and I'll say, before you left your apartment on Sunday morning, did you tell anyone you intended to shoot Oswald? Inspector then said, now the question will be, from the time you left your apartment on Sunday morning, did you tell anyone you intended to shoot Oswald? So they've taken that first question away that was wide open for a time thing. And then Spector says, now we've broken it three ways. In the first place, before you left your apartment on Sunday, did you tell anyone you intend to shoot Oswald? And Ruby said, now you've got to get another question in there. Previous to your arising on Sunday morning, have you told anyone you're going to shoot Oswald? You see my point? Previous to my arising, which would leave open Saturday afternoon or Wednesday or whatever, or Friday night when he was in the jail seeing Lee Harvey Oswald. Inspector says, well, we'll do it this way. Before you went to bed on Saturday night, or early Sunday morning, did you tell anyone you intended to shoot Lee Harvey Oswald? Which leaves out what he did in the afternoon or the dinner hour or the evening hour. Before he went to bed in the apartment, did he tell anyone? And Ruby said, that's right. Also, whether I received any phone calls from anyone from the time I went to bed until I arose. You follow me? Because if the plans were all made ahead of time, why would somebody call him on Saturday night right after the president is shot? I'm sure all directions and orders took place earlier. And Ruby says, ask whether I received any phone call from the time I went to bed on Saturday night till I got up. Do you follow me? He said, in other words, I could clear myself by answering that question truthfully. And District Attorney Alexander, Assistant DA, says, may I make a suggestion? Did you tell someone by telephone you intended to shoot Oswald? Now that's also a good question, because if he was in the offices of buildings, he's not going to discuss it by telephone. But Fowler, the attorney for Ruby, says, now we will certainly object to a question being framed by this attorney. Inspector said, are you concerned about the disclosure of this information in the presence of Mr. Alexander? And Ruby's attorney said, I am. Inspector said, would it be agreeable with you if Mr. Alexander left the room while this question is being formulated so we can understand it? And Alexander said, Jack knows that I know the answer to it, so there's no use in getting upset about it. And Ruby said, are you sure you know the answer to it? And Alexander says, I think so, Jack. Spector, Mr. Alexander, do you have any objection to stepping out just while we formulate this question? Alexander says, not at all, not at all. Come on, Joe. And he wants Joe Tannehill, the attorney that Ruby can't stand, to come with him. And Tannehill says, I don't have to go. My jester says he doesn't want to miss the fun. So Alexander walks out alone. And Arlene Spector says, Mr. Ruby, we want to phrase the question in a way that gets the point, as you see the point. So tell us exactly what you have in mind here. Now, this wasn't what Mr. Herndon, the FBI man, had asked, but this is what Ruby wanted to say. And Herndon said, here's the area we're trying to cover. Here's the question I originally asked you, which created all this problem. Then he gets back, between the assassination, that's when John Kennedy was killed, and the shooting of Lee Harvey Oswald, did you tell anyone that you're thinking of shooting Oswald before you did it? And that would include that Saturday afternoon period. And Herndon said, now, I've tried to put that as plainly as I could. I'm not interested here in the area of when. And Ruby said, yes. But if you're speaking in the area of when, it's pretty incriminating. It's a long premeditation, then, of time element. And his lawyer, Fowler, says, Jack, let me say this now. This is the very crux of your case. In other words, if there is premeditation on your part to kill or murder, this canon will be used against you in this information. If you want a new trial, if your answer to these questions is yes, it would be most difficult to appear and then defend you. And Ruby said, Clayton, I'm here to tell the truth. I don't know how the heck to answer it. I appreciate that you're in a tough spot. Fowler says, well, of course, as you can readily see, that's why we advise you not to take this polygraph test. And Ruby said, that's why I want it, because I know what's best for me. And Fowler said, well, I don't think you do, Jack. And Ruby says, can I overrule you, Clayton, where you won't be too angry if I overrule you? And Fowler says, well, I'm not going to put a cob in your mouth, Jack. And Arlene Specter said, I would like to ask Mr. Ruby if he's willing to answer the question about the conversations. If you're willing to answer at this time, which is, did you tell anybody that you intended to shoot Oswald at any time before you did it? Arlene Specter asked him. And I would follow that if you answer that question, yes, with whom did you tell it and when? With that information, we can formulate these questions to put on the lie detector test. And Ruby looks at his attorney, Clayton, please, I've got to do this. I've got to, because I told the Warren Commission. He had told the Warren Commission in Volume 5, testifying that there was a whole new form of government that would take over, that there would be these pogroms of the czarists that killed Jews, that because of what he did, a whole new government would take over. And he wanted to tell the truth, and he wanted a polygraph test. And he says, I've got to. I told the Warren Commission. And Fowler says, in other words, these questions have already been talked about. Ruby says, yes. And will you ask him to come in, meaning Alexander? And Specter says, well, we deliberately didn't go into some areas, suffice it to say, for certain points. The assistant DA that was prosecuting Jack Ruby was Alexander. And Arlene Specter, running for governor of Pennsylvania, says, right now, at the polygraph test, we deliberately didn't go into some areas, suffice it to say, for certain purposes. Specter says, but this is the question we're concerned with at the moment, and we would like an answer substantively, in addition to testing his truthfulness. And Fowler says, I don't believe he understands the full complicity of this thing. If there are any questions that show premeditation on his part, I would respectfully ask that he decline to answer and that you decline to ask. And Ruby says, so would you mind calling Alexander in? And Fowler says, listen, Jack, please listen to me. This man got down there and asked the jury to send you the electric chair. And Ruby said, I know it. And Fowler says, he hasn't changed his opinion yet. He'll again ask it at some later date. Now, is this the kind of man you want to pussyfoot around in here with and listen to these questions? Just yes or no. If it is, we'll bring him back in. And Ruby said, I want him in here, and I want you to ask him to come in, please. And Ruby says, bring him in. And Fowler says, I won't ask him. Arlene Specter says, well, I will ask him in, Mr. Ruby. I'm willing to bring him back in if that's your request. Now, Arlene Specter was the attorney for the Warren Commission, not for Jack Ruby. Specter said, Mr. Ruby, I want you to bear at this point that these men do not have to be here for the purpose of getting information for the Warren Commission. So we will know, he said, these men have come here for the purpose of getting this information for the Warren Commission. So we will know all the facts or for the purpose of conducting this test. So if it's really extraneous to you, it doesn't matter for them to be in here for the test. If this is all extraneous, he is rewording the question of when he decided or told people he's going to kill Lee Harvey Oswald, and all of this dialogue is taking place on that simple question. Fowler said, Jack, why do you want them back? And Ruby said, because I happen to know what I'm talking about. Joe Tonnell says, now, Jack. And Ruby says, Joe, you're not my attorney anymore. We both know it. We understand one another. Please, you're not helping me. And Fowler says, why do you want Alexander in here? And he says, I don't want him to think I'm holding out on anything. I don't want him to have any idea that I'm reluctant to answer things in front of him, believe me. Fowler said, I request you don't disclose these questions in the presence of the district attorney. And Ruby says, but Clayton, they know all these questions already. Henry Wade I spoke to, I told him all this. And Fowler says, well, if he knows them already, then why not just let him stay out? You're not trying to impress him, are you? Do you think he can do anything to help you right now? And Ruby said, no, but the thing is that I have a few other thoughts in mind, and you know about them. What are they, Jack? He asked. He said, that I spoke to you about for your consideration. And his attorney said, Jack, I'm not worried. I'm not concerned about anybody trying to do away with me. That is the least of my worries. 3 other men that had been in Jack Ruby's apartment had been killed, and his other attorney had died, and evidently he thought that if they continued, Mr. Fowler would be killed. And Ruby said, I want harmony. That's what I want. I want harmony with you in the DA's office. And Fowler said, well, we can't harmonize over your situation. I'm sorry. The point we got to was the question of getting information, Spector said, before going on with the test. Did you tell anyone that you intended to shoot Oswald? Arlene Spector asked it again. Before they write up the test, then they can reword it. Did you tell anyone you intended to shoot Oswald? Jack Ruby comes back in again. You mean before? And he's got that same answer again, before. He never gives up. And Spector says, well, I don't know if we're going to get an answer to this or not. And Fowler said, Jack, the question is being directed to you at this time. Go right ahead. And then Ruby goes back and he says, Sunday morning? Whom did you tell? He said, I told George Senator in my apartment. And Spector said, put in precise words that you can remember just what you said at that time on Sunday morning. And Ruby says, well, he didn't say anything. The funny part, he was reading the newspaper, and I was so carried away emotionally, I don't know how I said it. I didn't say it in any vulgar manner. He was supposed to have said to Senator, I'm going off to kill the president. But there wasn't, according to Ruby, anything vulgar about this. He just said it. Ruby said, would you mind asking me on this particular point when they word the question? On Sunday morning, that's the only time any thought ever came to my mind. Ask me about that. And Spector said, now let's prepare the question this way. Aside from anything you said to George Senator, did you ever tell anyone you intended to shoot Oswald? And Ruby said, no, after sparring all this time. And so Mr. Herndon had asked him a question of the FBI. He said, strike with the original question that commences, did you tell anyone you were thinking about it? If it's all right with you, gentlemen, we'll start the Series 3 all over again to read this way. Between the assassination and the shooting, did anybody you know tell you they knew Oswald? And then, aside from anything you said to Senator, did you tell anyone else you intended to shoot Oswald? Now, they never asked him, did anyone tell you to shoot Lee Harvey Oswald? In the 26 volumes, Jack Ruby was about to get a fancy nightclub. He had been to a realtor to rent a Playboy-type operation, which was always a dream of his. He had been to a decorator to fix it up. He had been with a woman, Mrs. Bertha Cheek, whose sister ran the rooming house, Erlene Roberts, where Lee Harvey Oswald stayed, and a stripper of Ruby stayed at that same rooming house. And Bertha Cheek had come to offer Jack Ruby a large sum of money just 3 weeks prior to the assassination. And the Warren Commission knew it, and Jack Ruby had been to a real estate office, and he also had $40,000 in debts to the IRS that were sitting in the hands of the federal agencies this week prior to the assassination. And when Jack Ruby died, he left a small amount of money but no debts. There was nothing on the book about these debts of $40,000. So Ruby, prior to the assassination, was meeting with Bertha Cheek, who was offering this large amount of money. He was meeting a realtor, he was meeting a decorator, and he owed the IRS $40,000. And a person staying at the rooming house with Lee Harvey Oswald also worked for Jack Ruby, and the rooming house was owned by the sister of the woman who was giving him that money. And here is Jack Ruby being asked, did you tell? And the question was never worded, did anybody tell you to kill Lee Harvey Oswald? Once he received orders, he didn't have to pass on, I'm going to kill Lee Harvey Oswald, I'm going to kill Oswald. And the avoidance of what happened from the Sunday morning is the crux of rewording this question, so that nothing prior, when they begin the area from the assassination until he killed Oswald, he always gets it back into the Sunday morning question. So Mr. Herndon said, strike the original question that commences, did you tell anyone you were thinking about killing Lee Harvey Oswald between the assassination and the shooting? Did anybody you know tell you they knew Oswald? It's not did anybody you know tell you to kill Lee Harvey Oswald? There was a hypnotist in the nightclub, Billy Del Mar, who was never called as a witness before the Warren Commission. Jack Ruby knew David Ferry, a hypnotist who was in Dallas at the time of the assassination, supposed to be outside of Parkland Hospital, and didn't account for his whereabouts after he left New Orleans, suspected of having an airplane as a pilot for a getaway plane after the assassinations. Could Jack Ruby have been told and hypnotized he'd be a hero, and then he was told, just kill Lee Harvey Oswald? There's this time element of what he was doing and how they circumvented in all this testimony. And Arlene Specter said, we'll add this to the question. Aside from anything you said to George Senator on Sunday morning, did you tell anyone else you intended to shoot Oswald? Now, of course, that is a ridiculous question. He received a phone call from Connie Trammell. He leaves the apartment and says, I'm going to shoot Lee Harvey Oswald. And then he goes to Western Union and down the ramp at the police department. He's not going to send a telegram and say, hey, I'm going across the street and kill Lee Harvey Oswald. And he's not going to tell somebody he did. So the polygraph test just says, did you tell anyone on the way? Now, the other question in those series was, is your last name Ruby? Do you live in Dallas? Are you married? Were you in the military service? Did you receive disciplinary action? Did you shoot Oswald in order to silence him? And Jack Ruby answered no to that question on the polygraph test. But this long segment from Volume 14 is how they tangled with an original question and worked around it and avoided the question of, was he told by anybody on Saturday afternoon or Wednesday that he was, in payment for his debts and the new nightclub, to kill Lee Harvey Oswald? Then I asked him another series of questions. Did you first decide to shoot Oswald on Friday night? And he said no, because he could have been in the office on Wednesday and been told that he was going to have a job to do on the weekend. They said, did you decide to shoot him on Saturday morning? And he said no. Then they said, did you decide to shoot Oswald on Sunday morning? And he said yes. But he also could have decided on Saturday afternoon, too. See, that's left wide open there because they asked about Friday night, Saturday morning, and then the Saturday afternoon is left out of the questions, and they jump to Sunday. Again, I can't find any record of the Saturday afternoon activities of Jack Ruby. I want to make a correction. It wasn't Tammy True that he talked to. I have her name because in the Torbett document and various pieces of researchers, the various assassins that were in the Dallas-Fort Worth area stayed at the home of Tammy True, one of Jack Ruby's strippers. It was little Lynn who spoke to him on the telephone the morning that he killed Lee Harvey Oswald. In the course of questioning Jack Ruby, they asked him about was he in the jail Friday night, and he said yes, and they allocated for that time, and they asked him in the Warren Commission various activities of his days and the hours, and as I say, the Saturday afternoon is missing. And then to wind up the polygraph test, Arlene Specter said, we asked you very carefully in a number of ways, and one way Mr. Herndon asked you is, did you think of it on Friday, on Saturday, and you said no, and on Sunday you said yes. He could have thought of killing Lee Harvey Oswald on Wednesday, and he could have thought of killing him on Sunday. He could have been told to do it on Wednesday or programmed to do it when he was at the office of H.L. Hunt on Wednesday, and he could have killed him on Sunday. And Arlene Specter says, we covered that very thoroughly, and they commended themselves for the way they did it. And Jack Ruby concluded the polygraph test, and he said, wait, isn't there something more we can bring out? And Jack Ruby said, well, there's something I had in mind that we should frame these questions. And so Joe Tunhill said, are you 100% patriotic American citizen? And Jack Ruby liked that. And Alexander then said, are you a law-abiding citizen? And Jack Ruby said, that's better, that's the question. Now, remember, he had been charged with shooting a man handcuffed who had only been arrested for a crime and not even found guilty. And in Texas law, I suppose, he could pass a polygraph test that he was a law-abiding citizen, an American citizen. So Mr. Herndon of the FBI said, well, those questions can be asked. And Ruby said, now that's very good, Joe Tannehill. He said that Joe Tannehill asked a very good question, and Arlene Specter said, I think we've covered the important substantive questions that we've asked you. So at the end of the polygraph test, they asked him, are you a law-abiding American citizen, and is your name Jack Ruby? And he said, yes. Do you consider yourself 100% American patriotic? And he said, yes. Is all the testimony you've given true? And he said, yes. And then Arlene Specter said, assign your name about 10 times for us. I would like you to sign it and date it. And now write this, he said, for us underneath here. Write it 10 times. Now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their countrymen. And Jack Ruby asked for his eyeglasses to Joe Tannehill, and he wrote, now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their countrymen. And that was the end of his polygraph test. And then when the men were leaving the room, and the court stenographer was in there, and you can find it in volume 14, page 570 of the hearings, Jack Ruby said to Joe Tannehill, who he hated, are you going to do what I asked you to? And Tannehill said, I'm going to do my best. You know me well enough that I'm going to do my best. And Ruby said, I know you well enough. And Herndon said, you were very cooperative, Mr. Ruby. And Jack Ruby, Joe Tannehill then says, goodbye, Jack. It's very good to see you. And Ruby said, you're going to do what I asked you to do? And Tannehill said, I'm going to do my best. I told you I would. Everything I do is for your best interest. I've worked awfully hard. And Ruby said, I know, and you're a big man, and I know how big you can be. And Tannehill said, I'm going to do my best, like I said, and I'm not going to let anything under the sun happen. Ruby, you know what I'm talking about? Joe Tannehill, I know exactly what you're talking about. And before they left the room, Mr. Tannehill and Alexander were out of the hearing of the court stenographer, but made note that the men all went in a huddle and talked with each other, and then Jailer Holman walked off and put his arms about Ruby and led him out of the door. So much for the polygraph test of Jack Ruby. Many of you can get access to these books, but I think it's pretty high drama, and I did want to share it with you because it just shows the way that Ruby worked with people such as the prosecutor to write his own questions, and with the Warren Commission to reword questions so that they carefully avoided any mention of that notorious Wednesday at the office of H.L. Hunt, or what that absence in time that somehow or other I received the message from whatever source, I'll never know, that he was at Hunt's home on Saturday afternoon. That doesn't mean it's true, and you may not believe in psychic phenomena, but just find out where he is for me, and we'll fill in the blank pages, and that's all I can ask from you. Time remaining, I just wanted to add a few comments to the tape last week that I did on Alger-Hiss and the Whittaker Chambers documents that were released from the Freedom of Information Act. I didn't have time to say that just at the time Meyer Zelligs passed away, he had a heart attack, and he supposedly had cancer, but it hadn't gone very far along. When Meyer died this year, I think it was February of 1978, a book came out just at the same time by Alan Weinstein called Perjury, Hiss Chambers Case. And, of course, he got a lot of attention in the New York Post and New York Times and various publications on a book that confirms that Alger-Hiss was guilty. But if you want a background of where Alan Weinstein got his material to write his book, check out the New York Times. That is July the 23rd, 1978. There's an article on the Hoover Institute, the conservative think tank out in Palo Alto, attached to the university at Stanford. There's a whole library. This library was set up by Herbert Hoover after World War I, and they brought over there all the Tsarist secret police files from the Okhrana, the Okhrana, and they moved them to the Stanford Library and then into their own new building in 1941. That's when I was a sophomore at Stanford. And this library has the names of not only the secret police but the Tsarist families, and that is where George DeMohrenschildt works, the the brother of George DeMohrenschildt, not George himself, his brother, works at the Hoover Library, I understand, and Jean DeMohrenschildt had testified that the two DeMohrenschildt brothers, known, their real name was von Mohrenschildt, were Nazi spies and part of the Nazi organization. His brother works at the Stanford Library there, the Hoover Library, and they do have a list of czarists. I always believe that Marina Oswald is related to the DeMohrenschildt family in Minsk, and they would have names of czarist families going back to Marina's parents and grandparents who, under the cover of being communists, took on the coloration of the country until they could get out, until she could get out and do further damage by smearing the Russians and making a Russian plot in the killing of the President of the United States with the help, as I said last week, of Isaac Don Levine. Now, in this library, they have some of the Goebbels' original diaries and Himmler's diaries, and it's a very important place to get information. The director of the Hoover Library is a Mr. Campbell that came originally from Canada to Harvard, and he was put on the Board of Regents of the University of California by Ronald Reagan, who works with this group very carefully and with the Nazis and the czarists. And in 1964, he took time out to advise Barry Goldwater for his political Nazi czarist right-wing links. And Mr. Campbell runs this library that is funded by Adolf Coors and the Times Mirror, which is also the Dallas Times Herald, and Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of California, and the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, and there's grants from various corporations. It's a heavily funded right-wing Nazi czarist gold mine of information, and it was there that Mr. Alan Weinstein went to write the book called Perjury about Alger Hiss. It was a good place for him to continue to hide the possible Nazi links of George Messerschmitt and Whittaker Chambers. Our time is up on this tape, and next week we'll be talking about Patricia Hearst. I apologize for the quality of the tapes, but I hope to have my cassette machine fixed within a few weeks and maybe get the tone back a little better if we can.